Okay, so in this video, we're going to start, for those of you that keep track of this, chapter 25. And chapter 25 is on early modern Africa. So if you remember how we're talking about time period 4, which is also called the early modern period, we're kind of thinking about this like a ripple effect. So we spent a lot of time talking about Europe, and now we're into the second part of the ripple. So we've talked about how Europe transformed, and now we're talking about the places that were directly influenced by the Europeans. So in the first set of videos, we talked about the Western Hemisphere and how the Europeans influenced the Western Hemisphere. Now we're going to talk about how the Europeans influenced Africa. So the Europeans were just as successful in influencing Africa. And when we're thinking about where they're influencing Africa, it's mostly coastal Africa. Africa is a really big place, and the Europeans really weren't too involved in areas in Africa away from the coast. So European influence in Africa is mainly about 100 miles inland. But the Europeans were successful in influencing Africa, but not to the same extent as seen in the Western Hemisphere. And a big reason for that is that the Africans were immune to European diseases. So while the people in the Western Hemisphere were completely decimated by European diseases like smallpox or measles, people in Africa had the same level of resistance to those diseases that the Europeans did, and so they weren't as easily taken out by disease. Another question we might ask ourselves before we delve deeper into looking at Africa is why were the Europeans successful in this project? Like, why were they able to exert their influence over Africa more than any other place we've looked at? And so one reason that we might think about is the fragmented nature of European society, or European politics, we'll put it like that. Basically, all of the European countries had to compete with each other for economic gain or technological innovation. And through this competition, the competition made them really good at fighting. They got a lot of practice at exploiting economic gains, using technology to their advantage, and generally just fighting wars. They fought a lot of wars. And practice makes perfect, and they were really good at it. The other thing we could say is kind of the opposite. So if the Europeans were good at this, why weren't other places? Like China was much richer and technologically advanced than the Europeans. Why didn't they do this? Well, other societies weren't driven by this level of competition. So, for example, the Chinese were united. Like there was one Chinese government. There were lots of European governments. The same thing could be said about the caliphate. The other thing we could think about is that there were societies that were fragmented, like the Europeans. So, why not India? India was just as fragmented as the Europeans were. And I think the reason that we could maybe say the Indians wouldn't be involved in something like this is that they needed to focus on defense because of the trade routes, so their location on the trade routes. And let's face it, they were already rich. They didn't need to worry about doing something like this. The Europeans were fragmented and desperate, and they needed to do something like this or they were going to get overwhelmed by the other people on the Silk Road. So I think this is a exhaustive list of reasons why the Europeans were good at this, and we don't see other societies doing it. So let's take a look at Africa. So let's look at some early modern African states. So the last time we looked at Africa, we looked at two trade empires. We looked at Ghana and Mali. We're going to look at one more of them. Ghana and Mali are going to give way to a third trade empire. And this one is called Songhai. So Songhai is basically just going to be doing the same thing that Ghana and Mali were doing. Songhai occupied the same space. In kind of northwest Africa. Out of where Ghana and Mali were. And they're going to do the same stuff. They're going to trade in salt and gold. So they're pretty much doing the same thing. The problem is Songhai is going to get conquered by North Africans, kind of where Morocco is. And the North Africans are supplied with European weapons. And that's pretty much the whole thing, is that the Moroccans are the same people that conquered Ghana for not being Islamic enough. But this time, the Moroccans just want money, and now they have the weapons to do it. So now they have guns. And so this marks the end of these rich and powerful African trade networks, African trade empires. In West Africa. And they're going to kind of turn into small regional pieces, but that's pretty much it. This area is going to be controlled kind of indirectly by European interests. The same thing is pretty much going to happen to the Swahili city-states. On the East Coast. They're going to be taken over by the Portuguese. And they will eventually be given to the British and the Dutch. There are going to be some Portuguese holdings in East Africa that will last until almost the 1970s or the 1980s. But by and large, the British kind of replace the Portuguese in East Africa. So the old stuff is being taken over by Europeans or people who are funded by Europeans. The other thing that we need to pay attention to is that some African governments adapted to this new normal. So we're going to see some people adapt to the Europeans. One group that we might want to look at, or one government, is the government of Congo. Congo was supplied by the Portuguese. So, with guns and technology. And Congo traded things like copper, ivory, and most importantly, slaves to the Portuguese. So the Portuguese are giving them finished goods, manufactured goods, guns and technology, And Congo gave to the Portuguese high value trade items: copper, ivory, and slaves. But remember, what's important about these things is that they are raw materials. So Portugal is giving them finished goods, and the Africans are giving them raw materials. This relationship is going to pretty much color the entire relationship between Africa and the rest of the world pretty much until the modern day. Over time, the Portuguese demanded more slaves. Like, that was the thing they wanted, because the slaves were needed to work on the sugar plantations. And they needed the slaves more than they needed things like copper and ivory. They wanted slaves. Congo resisted this. And asked to send fewer slaves. This was rejected. And eventually, Congo was conquered by a government to their south, and the reason that Congo was able to be conquered this way is because most of the young men who might be soldiers were sent away as slaves. So the slave trade was basically eating Congo from the inside out. There was nothing left inside of Congo to defend it when they got attacked. And when that happened, Portuguese merchants abandoned Congo because war is bad for business. And so Congo ends up getting taken over. Another place that we want to pay some attention to in Africa is a place called Angola. And basically what the Portuguese did, the Portuguese moved from Congo to Angola. They basically took everything they wanted from Congo, and then they moved south to Angola, and they started doing the same thing. So this is kind of happening in the 1570s up until about the 16 teens. Eventually, the people in Angola realized what had happened to the people in Congo, and they started to resist more forcefully. And here we need to pay attention to this person. Her name was Queen Nzinga. And Queen Nzinga actively resisted Portugal. Like, she led Angola against Portugal. And she even went so far as to form an alliance with the Dutch against Portugal. Now, the Dutch were no better than the Portuguese, but they're at least somebody who has an interest in fighting the Portuguese just as much as the Angolans did, and they worked together. Eventually, though, after Queen Nzinga's death, she was in charge from 1623 to 1663. So after her death, the resistance kind of faded away. And the Portuguese took over. There's one little thing that I want to mention here before we leave this topic and we move on to other things, is syncretic religions. So we did look at syncretic religions a little bit when we looked at the Western Hemisphere, like we talked about the Virgin of Guadalupe as a symbol of mixing Christianity with native Western Hemispheric religions. We're going to see the same thing here in Africa, and we've kind of already seen this. Africans readily adopted practices from foreign religions. We've already seen that in time period 3. Africans adopted Islam, or at least Islamic practices, to gain better trade deals with Islamic merchants. We're going to see the same thing in time period 4, except now they're going to adopt Christianity. So we're going to see some Africans adopt Christian practices to gain better trade deals with European merchants. All right, so we're going to stop there. In our next video, we're going to look at the process of the slave trade. And this is one of humanity's darkest corners. So prepare to be depressed and horrified at what people are capable of doing to each other. But until then, this is Mr. Nissen signing off.